Singapore is a small island nation. It's so small you could drive across it in only 35 minutes, smaller than most large cities in fact. But this small country has managed to become one of the strongest economies in East Asia, boasting a per capita GDP of almost $83,000. But it wasn't always like this. Barely 60 years ago, Singapore was a struggling British colony with no natural resources, a high unemployment rate, and boiling racial tensions. Amazingly, almost all of this change was because of just one man. This is the story of how one man transformed a country. To understand how Singapore got to where it is now, we have to look back at Singapore's history. In 1819, Sir Stamford Raffles, a British official, established Singapore as a trading post for the British East India Company. Its strategic location between the Indian Ocean and the South China Sea made it a vital stopover for ships traveling between Europe and Asia. Singapore's deep natural harbour was a perfect port for international trade, and under British rule, the island became a bustling free trade port, attracting merchants, migrants, and traders from China, India, and Malaysia. But beneath the surface, the British colonial system was deeply flawed. This small country was home to a mix of many different ethnicities living in segregated communities, often clashing together culturally and economically. In 1963, Singapore merged with Malaysia, but this arrangement proved unsustainable, as only 2 years later Singapore was expelled from the Malaysian Federation and gained independence from the British. By that time, the country had been left with underdeveloped infrastructure, rampant unemployment, and ethnic tensions boiling. But amid the uncertainty of a country with seemingly no hope was a man who had a resolve to turn his country's fortunes around. Born in 1923 to a middle-class Chinese family in Singapore, Lee Kuan Yew was a product of both Eastern and European education, having schooled in the Raffles Institution, one of the most prestigious schools in Singapore. After high school, Lee went on to study at the Raffles College, another prestigious institution, but not to be confused with his former school. But his studies were quickly disrupted by the Japanese invasion of Singapore during World War II. After Singapore fell to the Japanese viewed the ethnic Chinese as being anti-Japanese, and as such, ethnically Chinese men were rounded up and taken to screening centers, where they were subject to interrogations and often sent to death. Estimates now place the death toll of what is now known as the Suk Ching operation at between 40 to 50,000. Lee was one of the Chinese men that was rounded up and screened, but luckily he was able to flee from this screening center that he was held at before having to lay low, potentially saving his life. The trauma of what Lee went through shaped his will to build Singapore into a strong nation that would never have to be at the mercy of external forces ever again. After World War II concluded, and the Japanese forces had been expelled from Singapore, Lee decided to continue his studies in England, where he enrolled into LSE before transferring to Fitzwilliam College in Cambridge in order to study law. After graduating, Lee returned back to Singapore, and in 1954 he co-founded the People's Action Party, a progressive left-wing party focused on progressive reform and anti-colonialism. His party quickly gained popularity among the working-class ethnically Chinese population for advocating for better labour protection. His efforts eventually culminated in Singapore gaining self-governance from the British in 1959, and he became the country's first Prime Minister at just the age of 35, coming into leadership at a critical time when Singapore was experiencing economic instability and social unrest. In hopes of a stronger and more united country, in 1963, Singapore merged with Malaysia. Lee worked tirelessly to make this merger work, but only 2 years later, Singapore was expelled from the Malaysian Federation. The reasons for the split was due to many factors, including political differences which led to race riots. With political differences between Lee's vision of an equal and meritocratic society, with equality for all people, including the small Indian and Chinese minorities, and Malaysia's ruling party's focus on Malay supremacy. The separation was unexpected, and left Singapore isolated and vulnerable, and uncertain of its future. Lee Kuan Yew famously wept on national television when the separation was announced, signaling just how dire the situation was.
I had believed in Malaysian merger and the unity of these two territories. As a people connected by geography, economics, and ties of kinship.
In that moment, with race riots spreading across Singapore and the country being kicked out of the Malaysian Federation, it seemed as if the country was destined to fail. But Lee quickly pivoted his vision for the country, away from a country that would have to rely on any other countries such as Malaysia. He envisioned a totally independent yet prosperous nation, and he immediately sets about achieving this goal for Singapore. Singapore was now a fully independent nation again, with a lack of natural resources to fall back on. The country was saddled with many issues, from rising racial tensions to lack of foreign investments and rampant government corruption, and Lee was acutely aware of all of this. Right after the split from Malaysia, Singapore was a poor country with no form of national identity. Singapore's ethnic makeup consisted of Chinese, Indians, and Malays. The young country lacked any idea of national shared history or identity. A random mix of different cultures and religions that flocked to the port city set up by the British less than 150 years ago. Lee realized that in order for the country to move forward, it would have to be united. In order for Lee and his party to not be seen as partial to one group or ethnicity, Lee learned how to speak all the major languages spoken in Singapore, learning Tamil, Malay, as well as his native Mandarin, allowing him to relate to all the different peoples of Singapore. English was decided as well to be the main language used in Singapore for government, business, and education, a move that was criticized by some for being too representative of the country's colonial past. But the move was ultimately successful, as it was needed to foster national unity by not favoring any specific ethnicity or language. The move was also important for education and commerce, as a country that could converse in the most widely used language on the planet had greater access to educational materials and made commerce with other countries significantly easier without a language barrier. But Lee wasn't done just there with unifying the country, as he realized that without any oversight, ethnic communities would tend to pool together into specific areas, causing ghettos, which would lead to ethnic tensions. Lee couldn't have that, and he expanded the powers of the newly formed Housing Development Board in order to allow the board to enact ethnic quotas within residential buildings. Quotas that would be more representative of the makeup of the country at large, essentially forcing all of Singapore's different ethnicities to live side by side. As well as all of this, Lee enshrined racial equality into the constitution, enacted strict laws against racial discrimination, and added public holidays from various religious and cultural groups to the calendar. Lee's ability to unite the country proved very successful, as whereas Singapore at the time was a country strife with race riots and ethnic tensions, Singapore nowadays is a multicultural society, with a mix of people from different backgrounds and cultures living side by side in harmony. Corruption was also a huge problem in the newly formed country, not only in Singapore, but also throughout much of Asia at the time. Lee understood that it would be difficult to attract foreign investments without an efficient government. The country needed to rid itself of corruption. Under Lee's leadership, the government enacted a zero-tolerance stance against corruption. Lee empowered the Corrupt Practices Investigation Bureau, or CPIB, giving them wide-ranging powers and the authority to investigate anyone, with one of the most high-profile examples being in 1986, when Minister Tay Chiang Wan, Lee's very own colleague, accepted bribes from property developers in exchange for facilitating land deals. When the CPIB investigated this, despite Mr. Wan's pleadings, Lee did not intervene on behalf of his friend, and he allowed the investigation to proceed. Realizing his arrest was imminent, Mr. Wan took his own life. Later, Lee expressed sorrow over the loss of his friend, but he reaffirmed his commitment to fighting corruption with no one being safe. Lee also increased the salaries of government officials in order to disincentivize corruption among officials in the first place. And over time, these reforms also worked, with Singapore today ranking as the 5th least corrupt nation on earth, according to the Corruption Perceptions Index. Lee's anti-corruption campaign led to a high level of trust between the government and the people of Singapore, and helped attract foreign investments into the country. Lee Kuan Yew stepped down as Prime Minister of Singapore in 1990 after 31 years of power. But although Lee had stepped down, his influence in Singaporean politics remained strong as he continued to serve as a Member of Parliament until his death. When Lee passed away in 2015 at the age of 91, a week of national mourning took place in his honour, and all state flags were set to half-mast as world leaders flew in to attend his funeral. Within Lee's own lifetime, he'd caused Singapore to go from a small, resourceless country, burdened with poverty and ethnic division, to now one of the safest countries on the planet, with an economy that attracts talent from all around the globe, and a country where its citizens enjoy some of the highest standards of living on the globe. The story of how Lee turned Singapore around remains a symbol of how vision, determination, and tough decisions can turn even the most unfortunate situations into successes. And in Lee doing so, he left a blueprint on nation building that countries still to this day use.
If you enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing to our Patreon, where you'll get exclusive early access to all of our videos a week before they drop. And if you haven't already, please consider subscribing and liking this video in order to boost our videos with the algorithm. And as always, thank you for watching.